There is no security solution to climate change. There is greater insecurity if we don't act. And the we is all of us. Historically, the military went in when everything else had failed. The reality is, if the military get engaged beyond their own responsibilities in the context of a changing climate, that means we as a society have failed to act.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan, and today's episode we're joined by Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti, a man who served at the highest levels of the Royal Navy, advised the UK government as a climate and energy security envoy, and now shapes thinking as Professor of Climate and Resource Security at UCL. Good morning, Admiral.
Richard, good morning.
My first flag officer retired that we've had on the show, so I'm delighted you could join us.
Yeah, likewise.
So we're going to be talking about a topic that I think is near and dear to your heart, and that national security becoming more broadly defined to include concerns about and adaptation to a changing climate. So just maybe take us through this, because you've been an early voice in helping to kind of make this part of the discussion internationally as well as here in the UK. But we can reset the table a little bit for the listener and the viewer in terms of like why it's not just an environmental threat, it is a strategic challenge.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the sort of 21st century, and particularly the last 10, 15 years, it's proving a pretty challenging period for society. I mean, there are multiple risks and threats to our prosperity and well-being, our national security. Some of those are very traditional. I mean, you have state-on-state conflict going on here in Europe. We see it in the Middle East. There's potential for it to happen further east as well. We've seen non-state actors engaged, causing either with states or within countries causing conflict. And we've also seen a growth of what I would describe as transboundary, transnational threats, often without any military origin. I mean, the pandemic, COVID is a classic example, but we've also seen in the economic world, in organised crime and other areas. And I think into that list, you have to add the impact of a changing climate, in particular the second and third order consequences, the impact on people, on their homes and on their livelihood. That's not to say that I think that climate change is necessarily going to be a direct cause of conflict, but it's something we have to factor into our analysis of the risks posed to our prosperity and well-being. And we need to look at it not just in the sense of what our traditional, perhaps, defence, hard kill or hard power type approaches. I mean, because the consequences of changing climate are much wider. Unlike other drivers of instability, they impact across multiple routes simultaneously. They affect our health, they affect our economy, they affect our supplies of energy, our food supplies, our water supplies, all of those sort of issues. And they push systems outside their natural ranges and outside of the way that society is geared up to manage those challenges. So for that reason, I and colleagues around the world have been arguing that in addition to all the traditional threats and challenges we face, we have to factor in the impact of a changing climate. Now, it isn't going to be the same in every place. Even two communities a few miles apart will be affected differently depending on their resilience, the infrastructure and the society they face. But the reality is, in a joined up world, you need to understand the threats to our prosperity and well-being wherever we live and what we need to do to try and reduce those risks. There is a temptation to say, well, okay, military, security community, what are you going to do about it? Well, actually, there is no security solution to climate change. There is greater insecurity if we don't act. And the we is all of us. I mean, historically, the military went in when everything else had failed. That's how a diplomat would describe it. And then after the military had fought their battle, Waterloo, whatever it is, the diplomats would go back in and sort things out. The reality is, if the military get engaged beyond their own responsibilities in the context of a changing climate, that means we as a society have failed to act. And the onus is on us to reduce those risks, whether it be through mitigation or adaptation, to the point at which they are manageable by society as a whole.
And I guess it's something that, because you've been looking at this, I guess people describe it as a threat multiplier in some cases, for really decades at this point. How do you think, how's the conversation evolved? Because I think it's something that kind of it pops up occasionally in on the radar. You see it, kind of a former military leader or like yourself, or someone else in the kind of defense and intelligence community who might come out and say something like this, and then it just kind of recedes. Has it taken hold in terms of actually shaping how we think about policy?
I think there is a lack of consistency in that area. I mean, if you go back to Margaret Beckett's UN Security Council debate in 2007, an organisation in the Washington area called CNA that issued a seminal report in the same year about the impact of a changing climate and security. That came in at a time when many Western powers were engaged in conflict or post-conflict, whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan, and the focus was very much in that area. And there wasn't necessarily the evidence of what was going on. I have a colleague in Bangladesh who used to say, if they don't believe me, just tell them to look out the window. And in Bangladesh in that time frame, you could see it. But if you looked out the window in the UK or in America or Canada or Europe, less so. I think increasingly we are now seeing evidence of how the impact of a changing climate, which has resulted in people losing their land or their livelihood, or we've seen crop failures extended over a period. People are beginning to say, actually, yes, this is a factor. Now, you've only got to look to America today. The present administration is of a view that this isn't a factor. It's been sort of almost wiped out of the lexicon in their security community. So as I said, there isn't a consistency there. And there's a challenge today because we find with a focus on resurgent Russia and conflict in Europe and the need for Europe to increase its spending on defence in order to provide an effective deterrence to Russia, that there's a danger that people will go back to the traditional, the answer is a tank, a ship or a fast jet. Now, what was the question? So there's a need to maintain the pressure. But the positives are NATO is very much involved in the area through its 2021 action plan on climate change and security, followed by their third assessment on climate change and the security impact, the report they produced in 2024. The United Kingdom produced its strategic defence review this year. It may not seem much, but the fact that climate change is up there as the first in the backdrop of persistent challenges is indicative that there's a recognition. Now, recognition is great, but you've got to act on it as well.
And that, like you say, I mean, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It did, and I think that you were quoted in The Guardian along with your fellow former flag officer Richard Nugent in terms of looking at what the SDR, what they would actually say, anticipating whether or not it would encompass this. So just to remind us, what is it exactly in that paragraph? Like, what is it bracketed with in terms of those other challenges? It's basically climate, it's terrorism.
You've got climate change and environment degradation is there first.
Yeah.
You've got the enduring threat of terrorism, uneven global demographic changes as the three headlines. Right. Now, they're big issues. All of them in their own would be a challenge for society. What we've got to do today is build a good, what I would describe in military context, situational awareness of what's going on in the world, understand what the implications of that are, what we've got to do to reduce, or not just the implications, but how that will affect our respective communities or societies, whether it be alliances or individual nations. Then what have we got to do to try and reduce the risks that posed? Who are we going to do it with? Is it with other nations? Is it with other sectors of society? And at the same time, look for the opportunities. I mean, there's a lot of narrative that this is doom and gloom. Don't get me wrong, don't underestimate that this is a really serious challenge we face. But there are some opportunities as well there in the sense of improving our health through cleaner air, in maximising the use of technology, advancing our technology, advancing our ability in generating jobs and economic growth and prosperity. If we move away from fossil fuels and use energy, either nuclear or renewable energy, we're going to see stability of prices, we're going to see security of supply, which is reducing the likelihood of risk to inflation, as we saw after Russia's invasion in 2022. But we've also got to understand who's going to do it and how we're going to do it together. And that's the challenging piece. If you look at most governments around the world today have been set up in what I describe as the Northcote-Trevelyan model in the United Kingdom. It's in stovepipes, it's responsibilities for certain areas, it's funded on the basis of those responsibilities, the permanent secretaries and ministers with responsibility, it's scrutinised by Parliament on that basis. And the reality is we now need to be much more cross-cutting, not just across government, but also with wider society, with business, commerce, and us as individuals. We all have a responsibility in this.
Right. And it's, I mean, I guess let's talk a little bit about the armed forces themselves, because I think there's a few ways in which, I mean, the Royal Navy, first of all, I mean, its connection to energy and innovations in energy, most notably the switch from coal to oil before World War One, that had such an impact on, the ability of the Royal Navy to operate during that conflict in different ways versus its adversaries. In terms of what some of the implications for things at the unit level now, I mean, is it in terms of you're now on the outside, but in terms of looking at how the organization is changing to adapt the military more broadly, to adapt to some of these changing conditions, training, logistics, deployments. I mean, what are some of the concrete examples you can think of that we could point to, or indeed, changing fuel systems that might be resulting in these, some of the changes that respond to.
Yeah, and I caveat all this with I am outside
Yeah.
now, so and others will have much better understanding. I mean, you make a very valid point. When Churchill made that shift from coal to oil, not only did it shift the way the Royal Navy operated, but it shifted the way society operated as well. And energy for defence has been key, whether it be in the sense of fast jets burning lots of fuel, whether it be in the sense of the Navy burning ships, the Army less so because it tends to be more. But I cast my mind back to when I commanded an aircraft carrier. If you're operating an aircraft carrier in the Middle East, you want to get your jets off the deck in hot weather, even short takeoff and vertical landing jets, you need wind across the deck. You've got to go at high speed. To do that, I was burning 9 tons of fuel an hour, which broadly equates to about 12 inches to the gallon.
Wow.
Apart from the affordability issue, there's the issue of the amount of CO2 that's going into the atmosphere from all of that. But there's also the logistics chain. I have to take my own floating tanker with me. I've got to protect that tanker and all those sort of things. We saw in land operations in Afghanistan, Americans did some analysis of the loss of life in moving fuel up in convoys, and serious casualties were taken. We also saw that the cost of that fuel was so there was a blood and treasure associated with that. We're not in the world, I think, of the battery-powered tank or fast jet yet or anything like that. But there were things that we could do, and people started to do. They started to think about more energy efficiency use. That aircraft carrier, they painted the bottom differently. It might have only been 13 inches to the gallon, but that's an 8% improvement in your fuel efficiency straight away. If Richard Branson's Virgin aircraft were taxiing on one engine, why were the Royal Air Force big aircraft taxiing on 4 engines? Everything had to have a diesel generator. Why do we run 10 diesel generators at third load instead of 3 at full load? But also making use of solar, of batteries. We saw deployment of solar panels. I've seen a wonderful photograph of a solar panel that had been clipped by an RPG rocket, but was still functioning. And as the guy said in the field, if that had been a fuel tank, it would just been, or a diesel generator, it'd been history. And I didn't have to have a convoy coming up. I didn't have to protect and those sort of things. But we can do much more than that. And I think pushing the boundaries of technology, looking for dual use. The UK produced in 2021 a climate change and sustainability strategy, which looked about that resilience element. What can we do? Whether it's a static base, in which case we can move in the same way the rest of society can. We can put solar panels in, we can put wind turbines in, we can put batteries in, we can do that. Whether it's an operating base, there's certain things we can do as well to reduce our dependency on fossil fuel. But also, I think the military is recognising now that their operational analysis has to look at what the impact of changing climate is, to understand what does that mean in the way of tasks, missions and tasks and roles. What kit do we need? How are we going to operate if temperatures are, you talk to people operating in Iraq in the summer, 50 degrees. How are we going to operate in that sort of world? Who are we going to operate with? If we're doing humanitarian operations, and although you could argue that that's not necessarily the principle, well, it's most definitely not the principal use of the military. Military are frequently first responders and need to be engaged in that process. They need to be able to operate with humanitarian organisations. They need to have interoperability with those organisations. They need to be able to communicate with them, and they need to be able to train. And of course, that adds to a burden because you're now trying to train for high intensity operations, warfare, but also activities like this. Historically, the Royal Navy in the hurricane season, when the destroyer or frigate was deployed to the Caribbean, as well as all the other training you've done, the boys or girls would have done chainsaw training, humanitarian operations training, etc. And invariably they were deployed as a result of a hurricane. Yeah. Today we have to do that, I think, as you go east of Suez as much as if you go across the Atlantic, because you see from typhoons and monsoons. We also have to recognise responsibilities in the sense of, because of diasporas in our country, who are from regions which are being particularly badly hit by the impact of changing climate. I mean, if I look out the window today at home, I look at a farm where the ground is pretty brown, but at least we're still out there, whereas in other parts of the world, that land could be flooded or it could be completely parched, and all of that has a bearing.
And it's something that, a couple of things I want to unpack there. I mean, one of them is that I've always been struck by the fact that no one thinks of the military necessarily, and particularly Western militaries, as being woke, right? I suppose that's not something you normally associate with it. And somehow we've culturally coded, technology changes that happen to also have climate co-benefits as being somehow girly, unmasculine. If it's anything that's not burning a lot of petrol, etc. And then, of course, I'm thinking about this morning as like, the first kind of diesel electric boats. We have hybrid vehicles in underwater combat attack subs, for 80 years at this point.
Yeah.
And we don't really think of it that way. But the reason, you want an electric motor is that it's really quiet.
It's quiet. It's more energy efficient. It allows you to do a variety of operations that you may not be able to do because you had a noisy diesel boat or something like that. Yeah, and the point is that the military have always pushed the boundaries of technology. They've had to stay up. I mean, I think I read something the other day. The cycle time on drones in Ukraine at the moment, drones and counter drones, it's down to weeks.
Yeah.
And they're always pushing the boundaries of technology. We should be pushing the boundaries of technology, but we should be looking in the same way that we've seen in the past through space, through the military, advances of technology, having a benefit for wider society. The military is also recognizing, actually, we should be looking at what's happening in the wider society, saying, does this have utility for us?
Yeah.
Sustainable aviation fuel is a good example. Yeah,
and that's the thing I wanted to ask about is procurement, because I mean the SAF stuff. I mean, there's as I understand it correctly, there's a NATO kind of agreement whereby, all nations are agree to operate kind of aircraft that are able to take a certain percentage of sustainable aviation fuel as part of their load. And that percentage is meant to ratchet up over time. No one tell the White House right now because they might try to get out of that. But it does feel like that's the procurement aspect, is something that is an obvious one in hindsight, but is rarely talked about the decision to be one of the largest purchasers of something in the world. In this case, sustainable aviation fuel creates a market where it didn't exist before.
And it sends a message to the market. It sends a message that there is a need for it and a recognition. And as you say, the NATO thing, which was driven by the UK, but nations signing up, is a good example of that. So the market knows that it's worth investing. They need certainty to push this technology, and there it gets a message of certainty. So they will invest. Now, the cost today may be high. When Ray Mabus was Secretary of the Navy in America, he wanted to deploy an equivalent of the white fleet from the previous century, a green fleet. And he got a hard time from Congress and everyone saying, well, you can't do the cost, etc. He said, I'm not going to fight a war on green fuel today. I want to know if I can do it.
Yeah.
Because then in the future I can move forward. And so those sort of areas, I think, as I said, dual use technology, but also importantly, learning from the civil sector, not least in the sense of microgrids and other areas where actually then the defence experience can feed back into the civil sector. So it becomes, for a better way of putting it, a virtuous circle.
Yeah. It's something that, well, let's kind of change tack slightly and talk a little bit about the international environment. You mentioned how the UK helped push for that, particular, kind of change in terms of fuel as part of NATO procurement. But the larger international scene, you obviously, spent a lot of time as a not just as a warfighter, but as a diplomat, as an envoy, talking to the rest of the world in terms of some of the kind of nexus to some of these issues. How do we think we're doing in terms of, we're now on the 30th of our Conference of the Parties meetings coming up in Brazil. You co-authored a piece on reforming the IPCC. Just blunt question, are we fit for purpose in what we're doing, or are we just kind of spinning our wheels and actually not making the changes that we know are needed?
There are milestones, and Paris is the obvious one, but there are others where we've made lots of progress. But then delivering on that progress is increasingly challenging. Part of it is, in a sense, some of the low-hanging fruit has been taken. Part of it is the economic conditions we find ourselves in globally, some of it post-2008, 2009, some of it post-COVID, some of it as a result of other things that are happening. I think there's more that needs to be done. The COP has an advantage in the sense it focuses people's minds. But whether, with all of, for better way of putting it, hangers on and others, the delegates can actually get on with dealing with the specific issues. Are we prioritising what the right things are? It's highly debatable. The IPCC's big challenge, of course, is the synthesis reports, and others are government reviewed, and it tends to go for a better way, the lowest common denominator. You see it in the UN Security Council. I mean, there's been something like 70 plus debates and statements. But, one nation or another has vetoed, Russia's vetoed in the past. I could see America vetoing if we had one today. We are making progress, but I think the issue to get the momentum, you need society behind you. And to do that, I think you've got to get the right narrative. And actually, the debate in the UK on net zero is quite a good example of that. I mean, what is net zero? Your understanding of net zero, my understanding of net zero, the person next door's understanding of net zero is all going to be different. And we see people arguing about, should we have net zero by 2030, by 2035, by 2050, all of those sort of things. And it becomes a political hot potato. And one of the political parties has recently talked about the fact that they would defund anything related to net zero. They've talked about removing whatever was agreed at the strike price auctions for future energy supplies, etc. But actually, if you have a conversation about the risks, explain them in a language that people can understand, hopefully find a storyteller that the audience can relate to, and then talk about, yes, this is a real challenge, but there are some opportunities here which we should be looking at, and then start to focus on things that matter for people, whether it's the price of their electricity, whether it's the stability of their electricity supply. I'm an industrialist, I use a lot of energy. Do I want to have that price going up and down, therefore my input costs are varying, or do I want a steady price? There's always going to have to be compromises. Some people are vehemently anti-nuclear, others are very pro. Nuclear, I think should be in the equation because it gives you advantages, but there are other areas. Our grid is broken. Do you want to live with an old system that's creaking and falling apart, or do you want to move forward? And I've mentioned health and other issues. So those are the thought. It's got to be relevant to the people, the audience, because otherwise the COP in a distant land doesn't mean anything. Why are we spending time doing that? I think we've got to bring it down to much more local. Climate change is a global challenge, but I would argue the issues, and in many cases the solutions, are local, albeit you may want to share those thinking with other communities. And that doesn't matter whether you're a health department, you're an energy department, or your defence and security.
Right.
It's that sharing of understanding of the issues and best practice of ways of reducing the risk posed.
So, I guess the question is, the narrative is one part of it, obviously, but obviously there's also this institutional architecture that's kind of built up over the last 30 years, and some of the phraseology, like you say, net zero got adopted, probably by politicians who really didn't understand what they were signing up to in a lot of cases, which is one of the reasons it's vulnerable now. Because like you say, you ask three different people, you get three different opinions about what it means, but also certainly at the time, if you were, to tie someone down to a chair and get them to tell you what they thought they were voting on, I think very, very, very few people we probably could explain it to you in a way that would make any sense.
And the problem is compounded by the fact that what we're talking about today is a strategic issue.
Mm.
You can't just deal with it tomorrow
Yeah.
and then forget it for 6 weeks and then come back and deal with it. It needs long-term solutions. It needs certainty and commitment. We saw that in the UK in 2008 with the Climate Change Act. I think we'd struggle to have that unanimity if we tried to pass a Climate Change Act today.
Yeah.
And we live in a short-term, immediate, minimal risk, lowest cost society.
Mm. I mean, do you think there's prospects for, I mean, again, like we were talking about the institutions, COPs provide a focal point, but they're not really, we're not seeing a lot of implementation. We're seeing, if anything, a lot of governments moving in the opposite direction. So is it going to require a crisis of some kind to actually focus minds and actually break through some of these logjams? Because I mean, we're at the point where, we have 1.5 degrees, like no one even pretends anymore that that's something we're going to stay under. And people then say, well, it was really arbitrary. Like, well, not if you live in Tuvalu or, Kiribati or Bangladesh. It's not theoretical. It's not just an arbitrary line in the sand. So is it going to take losing a major city to something, to an event, to get people to actually break through this, we swing between, doom and paralysis from that and then complacency, it seems like.
I sincerely hope it isn't going to take a strategic shock of the sort you're describing, but you have to be very optimistic to think it's just going to happen with everything else that's going on. I think our elected representatives are probably at capacity, many of society are at capacity, and just the immediacy of the challenges. But there are areas, food is a classic. We know that prolonged failed harvests, etc., have contributed to movements of populations, which have contributed to tension in society, or exacerbating historical tensions in society, and which have resulted in conflict. But today is a piece in the FT about price spikes because of food, whether it's, I think, spuds in the UK, onions in India, weather from extreme weather resulting from climate change is doing that. If you get that sort of issue, that has an immediacy and starts to hit the individuals. That may, and there's lots of caveats in this, that may provide the impetus for action. But I fear, it is more likely that it's going to be some form of strategic shock that will give it momentum. Right. Which is a sad statement to make.
Yeah. But I suppose it's the irony being, I mean, it's when you step back and you look at population movements driven by failed harvests, driven by climate change, that then push up prices everywhere else. And then at the same time, it's either stop the boats, or it's in the States, building a whole gulag archipelago of new camps to put people in. It doesn't feel like it's headed in the right direction. I just think...
I think we are, after all the euphoria of Paris in 2015, we have struggled ever since to deliver. And because so many other things have been happening as well, it's been pushed back and back. It's not seen as an immediate thing. And yet the reality is that we've got to act now to sort things out for the middle of the century. I mean, we've got 30 years of CO2 locked into the system anyway, and we know what the direction of travel is. Yeah. But if we don't act now, we won't sort out things. Even though I think technology will make a major contribution, I am nothing like as sanguine as I was 15 years ago that technology was going to sort this out. Right. It is going to take action.
And in terms of them, just to finish up on back to the topic of the military and the future, I mean, it's right now we've seen, kind of rumblings that would have just sounded entirely crazy 20 years ago, of a president of the United States talking about, well, we need Greenland. Why is that? Well, they've got stuff under there that we can dig up now, and there's going to be an ice-free Arctic coming up in the not-too-distant future, which means we're going to be able to operate up there. But what's weird? Why is that happening? Why is the permafrost melting? Why is there going to be ice-free, zones of the Arctic in 5, 10 years, 15 years time? I guess, is that in some ways a recognition of reality? Is that we have changed our operating environment, and military establishments are going to have to actually presumably are, doing the kind of contingency planning and doctrine changes that are going to, figure out how to operate in those things. Do you think that the UK is doing enough in this regard?
I, again, I'm an outsider now,
Yep.
so I haven't got the detail, but I think there is a recognition, and you see it in bits of the Strategic Defence Review, that we are going to have to operate in parts of the world we haven't operated before, high north, elsewhere, that there are parts of the world which are going to become more vulnerable and more susceptible to risk of conflict, which may impact on UK interests. And that thinking is definitely happening. The degree to which it's happening, I can't answer that question. I mean, I've talked to colleagues who are still serving, and undoubtedly there are issues there, and there are issues about how we're going to how is defence going to adapt, have the right equipment, the right training, the right skill sets, etc., for the tasks they're likely to find. But in a sense, my successors are facing, well, not in a sense, reality is my successors are facing a much more challenging and complex picture of a world to look in. I mean, I'm a Cold War generation sailor, 12 nations, one threat. I knew what our job was, bring the stuff across the Atlantic while hoping the guys on the ground in Germany were holding the ground. It's changed tremendously over time since then. And not only have the partnerships and the alliances changed, but the threats you're facing have changed. And that, I think, excuse me, that's where you may have seen a piece that Richard Newgee and I contributed to in The Guardian. We have to look at national security as a much wider piece than just a hard power or defence and diplomacy. We have to look at it as that all of the things that affect Mr. and Mrs. Smith going to work, working in a building that's safe, that is comfortable to work in a job, and going home knowing that they can go and buy and get food. I mean, we import 50% of our food. If you think about these articles about price spikes and supply chain risk and this sort of thing, that they can they can charge their electric car, having moved on from their diesel or their petrol car. They can communicate safely with their children or grandchildren on the other side of the world. All of those sort of things. And they know they get the health treatment they need. That is national security, and that's a much more challenging picture than, say, 50 years ago.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture, but I'm glad we could have people like yourself around to kind of help steer things in the right direction, even if as an outsider. But your role at UCL is quite important in that regard as well. Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been a pleasure, and my final point is I am an optimist, and I think we will get there.
Okay, well, that's good news.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Jolly man, engraved on captain